Black waitress is ridiculed for her scars. Until a veteran recognizes the unit tattoo. It was a typical morning at Ray's Diner, where the neon lights flickered lazily in the overcast sky. The small Texas town had just woken up, and the diner's worn-out booths began filling with regulars, tired office workers, truckers, and people just starting their day. The familiar smell of sizzling bacon and brewing coffee mixed in the air, along with the hum of casual conversation, but for Kesha Johnson, the scene was anything but ordinary. To her, it felt like an endless cycle, each day the same as the last. The cruel jokes, the sideways glances, the whispered words that never stopped. It wasn't easy working at Ray's Diner, especially when every week, like clockwork, Davidson and his crew of pompous executives came in, ready to make her life miserable. They thought they were untouchable, that their privilege gave them the right to mock her, to humiliate her. And every week she smiled and served them coffee. Today, however, things were going to be different. Davidson, sitting at the booth nearest the counter, looked up from his menu with a smirk on his face. "Hey, Freddy Krueger came to work today," he shouted across the room, his voice so loud it rattled the plates on the table. "Hey, monster! Bring more coffee over here, but be careful not to spill it with those burnt hands." The laughter that followed was cruel and deafening. It echoed throughout the diner as every patron turned to look at Kesha, who was calmly standing at the counter, her hands steady as she held the coffee pot. Her black uniform, though neat, was a stark contrast to the cruel words being thrown her way. The scars on her hands and arms were impossible to ignore, stretching from her fingers up her arms, disappearing beneath the sleeves of her shirt. But Kesha held herself with a dignity and strength that the others couldn't fathom. Davidson and his crew thought their words could break her, but they didn't know her past. They didn't know what she'd been through. Kesha had faced far worse than their petty insults, and every word they threw at her only fueled something inside, a quiet, growing strength that they would never understand. As the laughter continued, Davidson leaned back in his seat, throwing in a few more words for good measure. "I bet it was from a fire in the ghetto," he whispered loudly enough for Kesha to hear. "Or maybe she was trying to cook crack and blew it up." His crew laughed louder, feeding off each other's mockery. "Or maybe her boyfriend did." "It to her," Davidson added. "You know how it is in that community, domestic violence." Kesha, with the patience of someone who had weathered far more than their cruelty, didn't flinch. She didn't show a sign of weakness. As she made her way to their table, her movements were deliberate, each step measured, the weight of their insults rolling off her back like water off a duck's feathers. She had long stopped caring about their opinion. She wasn't the person they thought she was. When she reached the table, she poured the coffee with flawless precision, her steady hands betraying none of the hate directed toward her. "Anything else, gentlemen?" she asked, her voice calm and controlled, not a hint of the embarrassment they expected her to show. Davidson frowned, thrown off by her lack of reaction. He had expected her to cower, to break under his ridicule. Instead, she stood before him, composed, unshaken. "Yeah, an explanation." He leaned forward, his malice clear in his voice. "Tell us how you got those scars. Was it an accident? Or did someone teach you a lesson?" For a brief moment, something shifted in Kesha's eyes. It wasn't fear. It wasn't shame. It was something different, something more powerful. It was the look of someone who had faced death and survived, someone who had learned to hold her ground no matter the circumstances. But Davidson, lost in his cruelty, didn't notice the change. He didn't see the quiet resolve in Kesha's gaze, the calm strength that had been forged through years of pain, loss, and survival. "Work," she said simply, turning to leave. Her voice was cool, measured. It wasn't defiance, but it was close. She had no interest in answering his question. She was done letting him control the narrative. Davidson wasn't satisfied with the short answer. "What kind of work leaves someone looking like that?" he asked with mock curiosity. "A nightclub bouncer? Or maybe a prostitute?" Kesha stopped cleaning the table next to them. She turned, her posture straightening as if she had been preparing for this moment. The shift was subtle, but Davidson could feel the change in the air. Something had shifted inside her. It was no longer about just enduring, it was about preparing. Preparing for the moment when she would stop letting them mock her without consequence. "You'd be careful," Kesha warned, her voice barely a whisper, but sharp enough to catch Davidson off guard. "Some stories are more dangerous to tell than you think." Davidson laughed, but the sound was different this time. It was forced, unsure. Kesha's words had made him uneasy. But he quickly pushed the discomfort aside, trying to regain control. "Oh, look," he sneered, "the monster's trying to scare us." "What? Are you going to burn us like they burned you?" But Kesha's mind was already moving. She wasn't just standing there taking it anymore. She had already begun cataloging everything. Every word, every look, the way Davidson and his crew spoke. The little things they revealed without knowing it. The names, the conversations. She was collecting information, and she was doing it for a reason they could never understand. Across the diner, James Wright, a man in his 40s, watched the scene unfold. He had been quietly sipping his coffee at a back table, hoping for a peaceful break during his cross-country trip. But the cruelty he witnessed at Davidson's table was enough to turn his stomach. He watched as Kesha stood, calm and unflinching, beneath the barrage of insults, and something about her demeanor sparked a memory in him. He had seen that calm before on the battlefield. The way Kesha carried herself under pressure. The way she took everything in stride, her focus sharp and unwavering. He knew that look. It was the look of someone who had been in places where death was a constant companion. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying this story, Kesha muttered under her breath as she moved to the next table. Her words were her mantra, a way to keep her sanity intact in the face of their cruelty. It was the one thing she could control. And as she wiped down the nearby table, she couldn't help but smile. Today was different. Today, things were going to change. The morning continued in a tense, unnerving rhythm. The taunts from Davidson and his crew had only grown louder, more pointed as they tried to break Kesha's unflinching composure. It was as if they could not fathom her strength, so they resorted to cruelty, pushing her every which way, waiting for her to react. But every jab only steeled her resolve. Davidson's voice rose again as he leaned back in his seat, his eyes narrowing. "What kind of work, sweetheart?" he sneered. "Because from what I see here, you just serve coffee and clean tables. Not exactly high-risk work, huh?" The air seemed to thicken with every word, like a storm brewing just beneath the surface. Kesha paused mid-action, her hands steady as she wiped down the table beside them. The change was subtle, but anyone paying attention could see it. There was a shift in the way she stood, a deliberate movement as if she was preparing for something. Assessing a threat? Davidson, oblivious to the change, continued his taunts, egged on by his own superiority complex. "Maybe you work at a barbecue joint and got burned. Or, better yet, a dry cleaner with all those chemicals." Kesha turned to face him again, her eyes locking onto his with quiet precision. "You know, manual labor is a funny thing," she said softly, her voice calm but now laced with a sharp edge that Davidson couldn't ignore. "It's funny how you always assume the worst. It never occurs to you that maybe, just maybe, these marks come from something noble." The moment she spoke, the diner's usual chatter seemed to fade, replaced by an almost tangible silence. Davidson, caught off guard by her unexpected response, stumbled for words. He laughed it off, trying to mask the discomfort creeping into his chest. "Noble? Look at you. You work in a diner. What could possibly be noble about your life?" Kesha's eyes never left his, and for the briefest of moments, a flicker of something passed across her face. It was the kind of look that could freeze the blood in your veins. It was the look of someone who had made a decision that the time for silence had passed. She wasn't the broken woman he thought she was. She wasn't the meek waitress serving coffee at his table. No, she was something far stronger. She didn't respond to his taunts with more words. Instead, she simply moved closer to him, her steps slow, measured, deliberate. She leaned in just enough that Davidson could feel the pressure in the air. The shift from playful cruelty to something more calculated. She spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper, but filled with a quiet intensity that made Davidson's stomach turn. "You'd be surprised," she said, her gaze unwavering, "how many things an invisible person can hear during business conversations, especially when those conversations happen every Tuesday at the same table for months on end." Davidson froze. For a split second, his smirk faltered, his brain scrambling to make sense of her words. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, trying to regain control, his voice more uncertain than before, but Kesha didn't wait for an answer. She had already heard enough. Her mind was a well-oiled machine calculating, analyzing, cataloging every detail she could use. As a combat medic, she had learned long ago how to assess a situation in seconds. She had been trained to survive under pressure, to gather information, even in the most hostile environments, and above all, to wait for the right moment. Davidson, seeing her hesitation, leaned back in his chair, trying to regain his bravado. He waved his hand dismissively. Come on," he scoffed. "What are you, a secret agent or something?" But Kesha didn't rise to his bait. She simply allowed the silence to stretch, her calmness radiating from her, making Davidson even more uneasy. "I know what you're doing," she said softly, her voice controlled. "You think your words can hurt me? You think your cruelty can break me?" Her words hung in the air, piercing the tension like a blade. Davidson's smile faltered for the first time, replaced by confusion. Kesha had caught him off guard. He had expected her to crumble, to react with anger, but instead she stood there, composed and poised. Across the room, James Wright, a man in his 40s, had been watching the scene unfold in growing discomfort. He had arrived a few minutes earlier, hoping to enjoy a quiet coffee while on his cross-country trip, but the verbal abuse he witnessed at the table made his blood boil. There was something about Kesha's posture, the way she held herself. Even under the harsh words that tugged at a distant memory, there was something familiar in her calmness, the way she bore the insults without flinching. It reminded him of something he had seen before. His mind raced, and then it clicked. She was a soldier, a combat veteran. He had seen that kind of strength in soldiers, men and women who had been to places where death was an everyday threat. The way they carried themselves, how they never lost their cool under pressure. Kesha was no different. James had served in the military himself and knew the signs of someone who had seen action. The way Kesha moved, the way she maintained her composure, everything about her screamed that she wasn't just a waitress. She was a warrior, a strategist, someone who had fought for her life and was now using that experience to survive in a world that Didn't understand her. He watched her closely as she wiped down a nearby table, muttering something under her breath. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, she whispered to herself, almost like a mantra. It was her way of maintaining her sanity, of holding on to the one thing she could control in the face of such cruelty. James couldn't help but admire her strength. She was doing what so many people could never do, standing up to bullies with silent dignity. But he also knew that beneath the surface there was so much more to Kesha than anyone realized. She had a past, a history that could completely rewrite the narrative of those arrogant men sitting at the table. They thought they were in control, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. As Kesha walked past James, he caught her eye. For the briefest of moments, he saw something shift in her expression. It wasn't just the calmness anymore. There was a fire in her eyes, a quiet determination. James felt a chill run down his spine. Whatever Kesha had been through, she had survived it, and she wasn't going to let anyone push her around. Davidson, still fixated on Kesha's composed demeanor, wasn't satisfied. His arrogance had been bruised, and the constant restraint she exhibited only seemed to push him further. He needed to break her, to remind her of her supposed place. The insults, though expected, weren't enough. Kesha's silence was louder than any words she could say. Maybe you worked in a dry cleaner, huh? Davidson continued, leaning into his words like a performer. Or at a barbecue joint where you'd get burned. You know, jobs for people? Like you? Kesha didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She simply placed the rag down, making her way to their table. The clinking of silverware filled the silence, a tension between them that had begun to rise in a way Davidson wasn't prepared for. As she approached, the entire diner seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable outburst. But Kesha was different. She wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. She had learned long ago that their words held no power unless you let them. And Kesha wasn't about to let these men steal her peace. She stopped at their table, her gaze moving from one man to the next as if assessing each of them. There was a calmness in her eyes, but it was a calm that suggested she wasn't afraid to act when necessary. The years spent in combat had taught her that threats were often disguised in words. She was no stranger to danger. Davidson, seeing his own words failing to break her, leaned forward once again, his voice now taunting. So, what's the deal? You want to act like you're some big shot, huh? Like your scars are a badge of honor. Or something. Kesha paused for a second, tilting her head slightly. Her black dress, a standard uniform that had become a second skin, seemed to absorb the insults in the air, yet her posture remained impeccable. There was something about the way she held herself, something that spoke of resilience, of dignity, that no amount of mocking could strip away. She didn't answer immediately. She simply stood there for a moment, observing them, the silence in the room thickening. Finally she spoke, her voice calm but filled with an underlying weight. You'd be surprised, she said softly, but with a distinct edge in her tone. It's funny how you always assume the worst. It never occurs to you that maybe, just maybe, these marks come from something noble. Davidson scoffed, his expression contorting in disbelief. Noble? Noble? What the hell are you talking about? You work here? You're just a waitress. Kesha leaned forward slightly, a subtle movement that made everyone at the table tense. You're right, she said, her voice low, each word deliberate. I'm just a waitress. But I know something about strength you'll never understand. I've carried people, wounded, under fire. I've seen death face to face, and I've decided it's not my time. Davidson blinked, taken aback by the sudden shift in Kesha's demeanor. His earlier words, so laced with malice, didn't seem to have the desired effect. Instead, he was starting to feel a sense of unease creeping in. He had underestimated her. He had expected a response, a fight, but Kesha's calmness in the face of his cruelty was only making him feel more uncomfortable. What are you, a soldier? Davidson asked, his voice dripping with mockery. A veteran or something? Kesha didn't immediately respond. Instead, she simply continued to stand there, her steady gaze never leaving him. The others at the table shifted, unsure of what was happening. Davidson was no longer the one in control of the situation. Kesha had managed to turn the tables without raising her voice, without even lifting a finger. Maybe you should think before you speak, she said softly, almost as if she were talking to herself. You know, some of us have been to places where we've seen things you can't even imagine. Places where life and death hang in the balance, and what really matters is how you handle it when the pressure is on. James Wright, sitting at the back of the diner, had been quietly watching the entire exchange. He had grown increasingly uncomfortable with what he was witnessing. He had seen this kind of cruelty before, but something about Kesha's calm was different. It wasn't just an act of survival, it was something deeper. James recognized the signs. He had seen this in soldiers, in veterans who had been to hell and back. There was a level of self-discipline, of emotional control, that only came from experiencing things most people couldn't even fathom. James had spent years serving in the military, and now, as a civilian, he had learned to spot the traits of someone who had been in the field. Kesha's posture, the way she moved, the way she dealt with pressure, it all screamed veteran. But there was something more. She wasn't just enduring. She was quietly fighting back, gathering strength for a battle they didn't even know they were in. The words exchanged between Kesha and Davidson felt like a low hum to James, He could sense the shift in the room, the growing tension. What started as a petty confrontation was turning into something much larger, something much more profound. He could see it in the way Kesha held herself, the way she absorbed every insult and turned it into something more. She wasn't just surviving this moment, she was learning from it, and she would use that knowledge when the time was right. Kesha's voice broke through his thoughts as she turned away from the table. "I'm not interested in your opinions, Davidson," she said calmly, but the weight of her words hung in the air. "But I'll tell you one thing. You've already underestimated me, and when the time comes, you'll wish you hadn't." Davidson, taken aback, opened his mouth to retort, but the words seemed to die in his throat. Kesha's calmness had unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. He had expected her to cower, to beg for forgiveness. Instead, he had found himself on the receiving end of a calm, deliberate warning that sent a chill down his spine. James watched the scene unfold with growing admiration. He could feel the change in the air. He had seen veterans like Kesha before, people who had been broken and remade, people who had learned that silence could be a weapon, that patience could be a strategy. Kesha wasn't just a waitress. She was a force to be reckoned with. As she continued to serve the rest of the diner, James could feel a quiet respect growing inside him. Kesha wasn't a victim. She wasn't just enduring the humiliation, she was taking control of the situation, using it to her advantage. He could see the wheels turning in her head, calculating, waiting for the right moment. For the first time in a long time, James felt a sense of awe. He had just witnessed something extraordinary, something far more powerful than he had anticipated. And as the day wore on, he couldn't shake the feeling that Kesha was playing a much bigger game than anyone realized. Davidson's smirk began to fade as Kesha moved away from the table, her steps calm and deliberate as though nothing had happened. But the damage had already been done. Every word she had spoken, every move she made, had chipped away at his sense of superiority, and it wasn't long before he felt the sting of doubt creeping in. He hadn't expected her to turn the tables this way. He hadn't expected her to be so composed, so in control. James Wright, still sitting at the back of the diner, couldn't help but observe the ripple effect Kesha had caused. He had always admired the quiet strength of military veterans, their ability to remain unshaken under pressure, to carry the weight of their experiences with a silent dignity. But there was something about Kesha that went beyond that. Her calmness, her measured responses, her ability to stand tall in the face of cruel mockery, it was all part of something much larger. Kesha wasn't just surviving this situation. She was orchestrating a comeback. As she continued to serve other customers, Kesha moved with a new purpose. The earlier insults from Davidson and his crew now seemed like background noise, mere distractions from the larger game she was playing. She was calm, poised, and in control, and Davidson's attempts to provoke her only seemed to feed into her resolve. The next few minutes were filled with the sounds of clinking coffee cups, quiet conversations, and the steady hum of the diner's daily rhythm. But Davidson, despite trying to act as though nothing had changed, couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. Kesha had left him unsettled. The more he thought about it, the more it bothered him. The things she said, the calm, the strength in her eyes, it wasn't something he could just ignore. At that moment, Davidson decided he wasn't done with her. Not yet. He would continue to push. He needed to show her that he was still in control. "Hey, monster!" Davidson called out, his voice raised, aiming for the same bravado he had earlier. "Don't think you're going to get away that easily. You're going to answer some questions, whether you like it or not." Kesha didn't turn to face him, but her posture stiffened slightly. She had heard enough. She knew that her time for silence had come to an end. The room was watching. She could feel their eyes on her, could feel their curiosity building as they waited for her response. Turning slowly, Kesha walked back toward Davidson's table. Every step was deliberate, controlled. She didn't rush, didn't look nervous. She simply walked with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what was coming and what she was about to do. Davidson leaned back in his seat, a smug smile playing on his lips. Well. Looks like the monster's finally going to speak," he sneered. Kasha stopped at the table, standing tall, her hands folded neatly in front of her. "I've already said everything I need to," she said softly, her voice calm but filled with authority. Davidson's eyes narrowed. He leaned in, trying to intimidate her with his words. "What's the deal, huh? You think you're better than us? Think you can just stand there with your scars and act like they mean something?" Kesha paused for a moment, her gaze never leaving his. She had endured enough of his cruelty. And now it was time for the world to see the truth. "I think you're the one who's out of place here," Kesha replied, her tone unwavering. "But you wouldn't understand that, would you? You can mock me all you want, but it doesn't change who I am and who I've become." Davidson, for the first time, looked unsure. His words faltered as Kesha's calm presence filled the space around him. He wasn't used to being dismissed, not like this. He wasn't used to being made to feel small. "Who are you, really?" he demanded, his voice laced with confusion and frustration. "Just some waitress who thinks she can talk back to me?" Kesha took a slow breath, the silence hanging between them like a thick cloud. She could feel the weight of the moment, the turning of the tide. The words she was about to speak would be the final push, the one thing that would turn everything Around, I'm not just some waitress, Fisha said, her voice low but strong. I'm a combat medic. I've saved lives under fire, carried wounded soldiers out of battlefields, and faced death more times than you can count, and these scars? They're a reminder of the battles I've fought, the lives I've saved, and the strength I've found in the darkest of places. Davidson opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The room had fallen silent, the weight of Kesha's words sinking in. Even his crew, who had been laughing just moments ago, seemed to shift uncomfortably in their seats. They could feel it now, the gravity of the situation. Kesha wasn't just a waitress. She was something far more powerful, far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. James, sitting quietly at the back, couldn't help but feel a sense of respect growing inside him. Kesha's words had struck a chord. He had seen her strength before, quiet, unassuming, yet unyielding, but this was something else. This was the beginning of Kesha taking back control, of showing them all that they had underestimated her from the start. The silence stretched on. Kesha took one last glance at Davidson. Now, she said, her voice even, you can keep mocking me or you can finally see me for who I am. But that choice, it's yours to make. Davidson, now completely off balance, stared at her, his smug expression replaced by something more akin to fear. His eyes darted around the diner, but no one came to his defense. The weight of Kesha's words had silenced the room, and even the once loud laughter from his crew had died away, and in that moment Kesha realized something. She hadn't just taken control of the situation. She had turned the tables in a way no one could have predicted. She hadn't needed to fight back with violence or rage. She had fought back with her strength, her truth, and the quiet power that came from knowing exactly who she was and what she had overcome. Davidson, now visibly shaken, stood up from the table, his arrogance completely gone. He reached for his phone, attempting to regain some semblance of control. But the damage had been done. Kesha had already exposed the truth and there was no going back. I'll show you respect when you earn it, Kesha said, her voice unwavering, her gaze steady. Until then, keep your insults to yourself. And remember this, sometimes the ones you think are beneath you are the ones you should fear the most. Davidson's phone rang insistently. It was Michael Stevens, his biggest client. What's going on, Davidson? Your actions are catching up with you. Kesha smiled, knowing the storm had only just begun. The world will see who you really are, she whispered, walking away from the table, her steps calm but filled with purpose. As the viral video spread, the fallout for Davidson and his company was swift. Clients dropped him, his reputation shattered. Meanwhile, Kesha became a hero, her strength and dignity now inspiring countless others.